China and 14 other countries forge ahead towards what could be the world's largest trade deal. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. It includes 10 ASEAN countries and 5 of its major trading partners: China, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. Together, the 15 countries aim to create a massive trading bloc covering a third of the world's gross domestic product. Until recently, India was expected to sign onto the deal, but Prime Minister Narendra Modi withdrew, saying the pact would hurt its farmers, businesses and consumers. Well, with or without India, the deal is expected to be signed next year.
The 15 participating countries have, on the whole, concluded negotiations, which marks a significant breakthrough in the building of a free trade area that boasts the largest population in the world, the most diversified members, and the greatest potential of development.
For more now on the proposed free trade agreement, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Atul Aneja. He's the China Associate Editor for the Indian daily newspaper The Hindu. Here in the studio is Arthur Dong. He's a professor with the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Also with us, Saruhan Atipalo is CGTN's Global Economics Analyst and the CEO of Berry. And from Amsterdam, Steve Keen is a Distinguished Research Fellow with University College London and author of Debunking Economics, The Naked Emperor Dethroned. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Saruhan, let's start here in the studio. Great deal of progress on this deal, this trade deal. 15 countries are involved. What will it do for the economies of that region?
Well, I think it's a great step forward in terms of getting the countries together. Now, let's remember that ASEAN countries, as well as the +6, have free trade agreements among them already. So a lot of the times you're looking at the analysts saying, well, this is a free trade agreement anyway, and they had free trade agreements among them. So what is the big deal? Yeah. The big deal is that they're actually progressively going to reduce tariffs, as well as simplifying bureaucratic impediments. For example, a company in Thailand now will be able to sell its product once obviously the agreement is enforced in Indonesia, and then it will go and be able to sell that in China without changing or without doing any other paperwork. And that's a huge improvement in terms of bureaucracy. There's dispute settlement. There is also small and medium businesses. There are 20 chapters that were closed. So in terms of overall economic activity in the region, this is a great step forward. It has to be ratified, of course. It's June of next year, and then I think it will be enforced. At least it's planned to be enforced in 2021. And I'm not ruling India out yet. I think they're going to be coming into that later on.
Okay, how will this impact consumers?
Well, it's a great market if you look at it, even though India is not there. If India were there and the agreement was signed with a significant population, 3.6 billion as opposed to 2.2 billion, it would be a huge, huge deal in terms of the consumer market. But I will also tell you there are some within the RCEP that are actually happy that India is not there. The countries that have similar economic structures, your Myanmar, your Brunei, Cambodia, so they're happy. Who is not happy is the countries that wanted to actually sell into the market, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians. So within the RCEP and ASEAN, the countries are divided as to whether India should have been there or not, but it's going to impact the consumer market in a very positive way.
All right, let me get Atul Aneja's view on that. Atul, we just heard India is not going to be part of the RCEP. It's one of the biggest economies in Asia. Why not?
Oh, well, I think Prime Minister Modi, who was there at the conference when the RCEP was held in Bangkok, has succumbed to domestic pressures which have come from various quarters. The Indian manufacturers were not happy with the RCEP, fearing that once India signs into a free trade deal, Indian market will be flooded by Chinese goods, undermining and undercutting the Indian manufacturing sector. And that resulted in a lot of pressure from the trade unions, including one which is part of the RSS, which is the parent organization of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. Then there was political pressure because all the political parties from left to right got together against the RCEP. So there were a combination of factors which were coming together domestically Finally, there was also recently elections in 2 Indian states, and the BJP didn't fare particularly well, and one of them was agriculture state. Right. There were fears by the farming community because they thought that the Australians and the New Zealanders, especially when it comes to dairy, would outcompete them in the market. So it's a variety of factors, both political and economic, which got together. And Prime Minister Modi had this option now, either to succumb to these populist pressures, which I would say, because I think, frankly, if India does not get into the RCEP, it would be a big loss in the long term for India. He had an opportunity to graduate from a politician to a statesman, but as of now, and I agree with the other speaker, that it's not still a done deal. There could be last-minute negotiations. In fact, after the RCEP was announced, that is, the 15 countries got together, the Indian Commerce Minister said that there are certain three areas which need to be addressed, and if those can be addressed, then India could still join the RCEP as a 16th partner member when it's finally up for ratification.
Right. Steve Keen, what are your thoughts on this deal? I mean, here we have the countries of the region representing a third of world GDP. How significant is it?
Well, I think it's unfortunately, I'm going to be a bit of a damp squib in this conversation, because the reason that trade deals are so strongly emphasised in the media is that, according to economic theory, specialisation is what leads to growth. If you actually look at the historical data, you find that, in fact, countries which have industrialised most successfully have normally started off with a period of protection. That includes China, includes South Korea. And if we look at one of the largest trade deals going, of course, that's NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and you certainly haven't seen Americans singing the praises of that. It's actually been a mechanism by which a lot of production is relocated from America to Mexico, which is causing much of the political tension between America and Mexico today. So I think this is overblown. I think that what it really is to me is a sign that China in particular has now got to the stage where it is so competitive that it can afford to drop its barriers and encourage other countries to do so. And I see this more as a sign of China becoming a global power in the same sense that Britain did initially, and then America, when they both went through the same process of having protectionist barriers to protect their industry. India, including one of the countries that England would not allow to export textiles to England, was India, before its industrialisation. Once succeeded, down comes the barriers. So this is a sign of the maturity of China, not a particularly impressive sign for the global economy.
Arthur, what do you think? Has China got to the point where it is so powerful that it can afford to drop barriers? Is this, as Steve says, a little bit overblown?
Yeah, I believe that China is realizing that as a result of its trade tensions between the United States and itself, certainly playing out over the last year and a half or more, China is now realizing that access to the U.S. market going forward, even if we have a trade light deal, so to speak, or a trade narrow deal, these tensions will continue. So China is, in a sense, pivoting and re-strategizing its overall economic strategies. It's also realizing that one of the largest options that they have in their toolkit is actually exploiting or opening up its domestic Chinese economy to utilize that as the sort of engine that drives the Chinese economy forward. One of the statistics that's meaningful here is that if you look at the statistics that have been recorded by SAFE, the State Administration on Foreign Asset Administration, the increase of FDI into China has actually increased by 5 to 7% this year, totaling for the first half, officially documented at about $79 billion. So despite the trade war with the United States, we've seen no slowdown in interest on the part of foreign companies investing into the Chinese marketplace, which also suggests that companies are going into the Chinese marketplace to continue to sort of ride the coattails of this sort of emerging consumer economy in China.
Sarwan, are we reading too much into this deal?
I think for parts of it, yes. I think we're making too much of it. But it is also a big statement that's coming out. And that statement is saying, from China's point of view, hey, we're here for multilateral trade deals. We're not going to do this bilateral trade deals that the U.S. has been pushing. I think that's a huge, and that's why I think China was pushing for this deal to be concluded with India in it in this meeting.
Actually, just on that point, with India being in it, the Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Li Yucheng, he's been talking about that. Let's listen to what he had to say.
There are a few outstanding issues that will be completed before the end of this year, so there should be no problem for the 15 parties to sign the deal next year. But we are also considering the concerns of India, so we are taking an open attitude. Whenever India is ready, it is welcome to get on board.
It's clear, though, that China wants India on board.
Absolutely, and I think India wants India on board too. But Atul said it very succinctly and very powerfully that there were political concerns here. But my issue here, Anand, is this, and I'd like anybody's opinion on this, is all the things that are mentioned that are against or that were against India's being in this agreement. If you look at the political aspect of it, if not now, when? Because Prime Minister Modi won an election by a landslide. He's still the most popular politician there. If you look at foreign policy, in 1992, India's foreign policy was look east. Now he moved it to act east. This was a great time to be involved in this deal. And that's why I'm thinking that it is not done yet. India, I think, is using this to extract some other concessions from the parties that are in there, who want India in there. And I think we're going to hear something positive within the year as far as India's involvement.
Atul and Asia, do you agree with that? And what kinds of openings would India be looking for?
Well, there were 3 points which were made. One was that the Indian negotiators wanted an automatic trigger mechanism in terms of goods, Chinese goods coming into India, which means that there was sort of an anti-dumping clause which India wanted to be included as part of the deal. The second thing was on labor and services, because India's strength lies in the services sector, especially its IT professionals and others, which it would have been great for India for them to have greater access, especially at a time when there's a US slowdown and there's a need for alternate market for the techies. And third thing was on country of origin, if I remember right. So these are the 3 particular dimensions which Indian negotiators emphasized upon, and on which a final deal could not be cut. And I agree with the earlier speaker that it's not a done deal yet. It could very much change as things happen, because apart from the economic element of it, there is a strong geopolitical element as well, because of Prime Minister Modi's Act East policy. If you recall, in 2018, all the ASEAN heads were the chief guest at the Republic Day parade in India last year. The Act East policy, where India also has a security dimension to it as well. So I think if India keeps out of it, there's a huge foreign policy loss here, and a lack of trust might breed a lack of trust among the ASEAN, which do want India in fact, most of them. That within the RCEP there is a greater balance between India and China, and that's one of the political reasons why the Japanese are very keen that India remains a part of it, as do the Australians, that there is an internal balance within this 16-member grouping.
Steve Keen, one of India's primary concerns, of course, as we've heard, is the impact this agreement could have on its agricultural sector. One of the areas that has been pointed out is its dairy farmers. The Indians point to the fact that there could be threats posed by Australia or New Zealand. So how do you see this being resolved? What kind of compromise is there to satisfy India so that it comes into the deal, and at the same time also look after the interests of Australians and New Zealanders as well?
Well, agriculture's almost always been the field of major conflict in free trade deals. That's the.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve. I'll get back to you.
That is still the case in Europe. Sorry. That is still the case in the European Union, that most of the disputes about the free trade deal in Europe concern agricultural products. And one of the issues here is that, particularly in France, wants to maintain the cultural aspects of the countryside. It doesn't want to have it all turned into factory farms, whereas it's competing with other countries that do want to have a factory farm approach. Australia doesn't have factory farms in that sense, but it certainly has highly mechanised dairy production and has much higher health controls as well, I would expect, over Indian dairy. So there'd be very serious dangers of competition for the rural producers in India. And again, it comes down to whether India is willing to make a move to protect the cultural side of its economy. Now, normally, because there's so much political power in voting blocks in the rural areas, that's what ends up happening. So there will be exceptions or vague rules which are enforced in a way to protect the local industry from the competition of a more industrialised approach to dairy.
Arthur, Steve cites the example there of health concerns in the dairy farming sector. There are other critics who've talked about the fact that this deal does not talk about, let's say, labour safeguards or the environment. Are there shortcomings in this deal? Too much of a focus on just tariffs?
I would say yes, in comparison to the TPP, which was about to be formed by the United States before President Trump abandoned it. These sorts of mechanisms and measures that both protected labor rights and also had an interest in preserving environmental standards, well, these things seem to be left out in this current accord.
Atul, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. They met on the sidelines of the BRICS summit that's just taken place in Brasilia. They also met about a month ago on what was considered an informal meeting in the Indian southern city of Chennai. Trade and investment being the top items on the agenda. This is what Prime Minister Modi had to say. Let's listen.
I would like if we get to see concrete results on our trade discussions bilaterally. Then we will be able to move a lot of things forward.
So, Atul, what are India's goals here?
If you see, when it comes to the bilateral dialogue, that is the informal summit in Chennai, I think one of the areas where India is very much concerned, in fact, that's become a political issue more than an economic issue, is the growing trade imbalance between the two countries. The argument from the Indian side is that the Chinese market has still not opened to India's competitive strengths, which are basically two. One is the pharmaceutical industry, and the other is the IT industry. And third thing also, because of the trade war with the United States, there were other agriculture products where India could have tapped the Chinese market, including soybeans. But on none of these, while there's been a lot of talk and debates, road shows, but finally it has not made much of a difference. And I think Prime Minister Modi has sort of sharpened the focus on repairing this trade imbalance between India and China. The second thing which has happened also is India signed a free trade deal with the ASEAN. And again, because of that, the balance of trade with ASEAN did not go off too well. So I think there's an accumulation of experiences which have sort of fed into the final stance which India took at the RCEP meeting.
Arthur, Atul mentions Indian pharmaceutical companies, Indian IT companies, who've been saying that they have a lot of difficulty entering the Chinese market and expanding in that Chinese market. That's a valid concern for India, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, these are two areas of strength, certainly areas of comparative advantage that India is very good, particularly with regard to the what we call generic drug business. They're very good at that, world class in some of these areas. And the IT industry has been a stronghold or a very powerful sector in terms of Indian service economy and in terms of their being very successful worldwide in the export of these services around the world. And so any sort of barriers, be they regulatory barriers or other types of barriers, can stymie the progress and growth of these industries in India.
Saron, I was reading an interesting piece on these negotiations in which the writer said that if you want to be part of these deals, you have to be in the room where the arguments take place, where there's a lot of persuasion, where there's a lot of arm twisting, etc. The country that was not in the room was the United States.
Well, actually, they were in the room, but they sent a national security advisor who's been in that position for about 35 days.
Right.
Not very well known in Washington, definitely not known in Bangkok. And Wilbur Ross was the Commerce Secretary, but I have to say Wilbur Ross, I think, has checked out from his position. He's not as interested, he's not as active about things. So what happened in that meeting is that the U.S. asked to meet all participants separately. And only 3 of them said, we will meet you. And I think right there is a sign of changing or shifts that we're seeing geopolitically. And those countries were the ones, I think it was Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. Yeah, and the Prime Minister of Thailand said after that, we're looking for cues from Washington. Because Thailand, if you look at their relationship with the U.S., it's been very tight. And they don't know what the U.S. wants to do. So yes, you're absolutely right. U.S. sent delegation, but they were not in the room and they needed to.
Yeah, its leader was not there. But what's the point of one-on-one meetings separately?
Well, it's out of courtesy, it's diplomacy. You want to meet, you're invited to this meeting, and you want to meet everybody there. So it's a diplomatic overture, if you will, but that was rejected. And I think that's something that the United States understood, because they have invited the partners now to Washington for a special meeting that will probably take place sometime next year. But look, we've seen this in the TPP deal. The United States had a great opportunity to play a bigger role in Asia, and for some reason, it chose not to, and now we're seeing it in the RCEP situation as well.
Steve Keen, let's look at Australia's economy. It grew by 1.4% in the first half of this year. The jobless rate in the country is relatively, well, it's 5.3%, and that was in October. So looking beyond that, what will the RCEP do for the Australian economy?
Not a lot. Again, Australia's mistake has been not to invest in its own industries. And this is the common fixation on trade as a means of growth ignores the actual data that shows that what actually gives you growth is not specialisation but complexity. I highly recommend everybody in this conversation, and most trade negotiators for that matter, to take a look at what's called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is put together by data scientists at Harvard University. And that has given a far better guide to what's going to cause growth in the future than any trade deal. And on that particular standard, the level of, they have a mathematical measure of what they call complexity. The higher the level, the better. Australia has fallen back 20 places in complexity between the last major report they had back in about 2010 and 2017. So by focusing upon trade and ignoring developing its own industrial base, the country's going backwards, and that's reflected in its lower rate of growth.
Atul, you were talking about the pressure that the Indian Prime Minister is facing, political pressure in India to be a little bit more circumspect about entering into this deal. But I was reading one report which said that the government is also under pressure from big corporations in India, corporations that are involved in steel and iron and rubber and things like that, because according to this report, they are protectionist in nature and they want that to remain.
Well, Anand, that's part of the story, because if you see the report by the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is the sort of macro body which represents the entire industry, their report favored quite strongly India's participation in the RCEP. So while there are areas within the industry which may not want it, but overall I think the industry was in favor of getting into it. That is the big industry. I'm talking of the top industrial houses, etc. But the medium and small industry, I'm not sure, because that's where the pressure came from the trade unions, etc. So there are differences within the industry, but overall, the industry seemed to have favor. That is the Confederation of Indian Industry into this. But I do think that Prime Minister Modi, because this is the beginning of his term, he could have gone ahead and taken hard decisions, because he's not going to face elections for the next 4 years, and there's enough time to create conditions which would address some of the fears and concerns. Some of them are real, and some of them may not be so real. I think there's a third problem with Prime Minister Modi faced was that in India till now there is not enough consciousness about globalization. Sections of the Indian economic elite are globalized in their worldview, but I don't think that's been mainstreamed right now. So there's an attitudinal and a cultural issue as well, which he is facing. But because he had another 4 years before the next elections, there was enough room to shape opinion in India while creating a safety net which might have done some good to those who would have been impacted by the RCEP.
Steve, there are also some worries in Australia that this deal will only be made public once it has been signed, and that any parliamentary review of the deal would not be able to change the text of the agreement. Do Australians need to be worried about this?
Yes, this is a trend which has applied with trade agreements for the last 50 years. Basically, the bureaucrats who are very much mainstream economists, mainstream economics trained, believe the public doesn't know what's best for them, and it's best that the bureaucrats make these decisions and make them as fait accomplis to the public afterwards. That is really the whole way the European Commission came about. If that were true, the global economy would be performing better now than it was 40 years ago in terms of rates of economic growth and levels of well-being. Categorically, that is not the case. So I think it's one of the other areas where textbook economics has led us astray. And as much as I'm a critic of political systems, the politicians and the public probably have a better idea of the consequences of these decisions than the people drafting those laws.
Arthur, looking at the big picture, what does this do for the whole idea of globalization, of multilateralism?
Yes, certainly. You're seeing an expression here that there are parts of the world, certainly within East Asia, that they still believe in multilateralism, despite the fact that the United States is withdrawing and doesn't believe in multilateralism. Here you're seeing before our eyes the formation of potentially one of the world's greatest trade blocs as it unfolds, with all the former sort of participants in TPP now engaging with each other to create a very, very large economic sphere, covering a third of world GDP.
So, Rowan, I have to ask you this. Given the current trade dispute between China and the United States, does this trade deal actually give China a victory?
To a certain extent, not vis-a-vis the United States, though. In terms of the geopolitical approach that we talked about, yes, because that shows that China is actually leading Asia and the United States is checking itself out. So if you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, yes, I think China is a step ahead now. In terms of how it will impact their U.S.-China trade war, now I can call it that, I don't think it's going to have an impact on it, because the United States had, in the past 3.5 years, 4 years, set an agenda for itself, and it doesn't involve multilateralism. So if they really cared about what was happening in ASEAN countries and with this meeting with the RCEP, they would have sent a higher delegation.
Okay. Very quickly, Atul, we've got a few seconds left. If and when India does get into this deal, when do you think that could happen?
Well, I think it could happen within the next year, so maybe 6 to 7 months, because the debate is still on in the Indian Commerce Ministry and other places in the industry and even in the farming sector. So it would require negotiations a bit time between now and the next 6 months, but it's possible that it could happen that soon.
All right, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.